Hi there, it's Frank here for Yogomi Movies, an offshoot of my channel Yogomi, where I talk about movies that I like. Now, this is going to start out with a question, and that question is, do you remember the first horror movie that you ever saw? Like, what was the first scary movie that you remember seeing? I remember as a kid growing up, the first horror movies that we saw, well, we didn't really call them horror movies, we called them monster movies. And I think about monster movies when I say that as like the classic Universal monster films like The Mummy, Dracula, Frankenstein's Monster, Wolfman. You know, that's what I think about when I think monster movies now. It would be a while before I would understand the concept of horror movies. But I do remember the very first horror movie that I ever saw. And this is a very funny situation because I remember being a really young kid and being at my grandfather's house. And the thing about being at my grandfather's house is that he kind of just let me do whatever I want. I would sit on the couch in his living room and just have the TV playing, and I would be able to watch whatever I wanted. It just so happens that this actually introduced me to some of my favorite movies of all time, one of which is my favorite movie of all time, but that's a movie for another video. But in this video, I'm going to talk about being in that setting and being exposed to the very first horror movie that I would ever see. And the movie is Horror Express. Now, Horror Express is a movie that came out in 1972. It was directed by Eugenio Martin. The movie stars Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, and most of all, Telly Savalas. Now, I remember seeing this movie maybe when I was around maybe 7 or 8 years old. I would say maybe 1976, 1977, roughly. And I also remember seeing Telly Savalas. Now, if you know anything about Telly Savalas, he's mainly known for his character as Kojak. That was one of my favorite TV shows as a kid. So when I saw this, I was like, yo, Kojak is in this movie. But it turns out he actually shot this movie before Kojak was even created. This movie came out in 1972. Kojak debuted in 1973. And it just so happens that the person who scored this movie, this was his debut as his work for musical composition on a movie, John Kakavas, who was a friend of Telly Savalas and would go on to do the music for his show Kojak. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. That's just a little bit of interesting trivia that I discovered that I just thought was really cool. Now, Horror Express is a very, very interesting movie. Now, if you watch this movie, you're going to see some similarities between this and a certain film by the name of Who Goes There, which was also redone by another one of my favorite movies of all time, John Carpenter's The Thing, which came out in 1982. Now, a lot of people have compared it and even accused it of stealing the concept of Who Goes There, which is also titled as The Thing from Another World, again shortened to The Thing in John Carpenter's film. The movie has kind of this claustrophobic feel because it all takes place on a train, the Trans-Siberian Express. And Christopher Lee, who is a scientist, archaeologist or something, on an expedition before embarking on this plane, has discovered this prehistoric creature that was frozen in the ice. Somehow they got this creature out of the ice and they're transporting it on this train. You can already see kind of similar concepts of some kind of strange creature frozen in the ice, and people find it and they decide to move it or transport to do some further studying, and that's when things kind of go awry. Except for things are a little bit different here. Now, like I said, it's got a great cast. Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Telly Savalas, and a cast and crew of so many other people. It's got this really amazing sort of like mix of sci-fi and horror, because the creature, as I said, is a prehistoric being that they found in the ice, and it does look sort of humanoid, sort of like, caveman, I guess you could say. But there's a twist. There's something about this that is different, and that's what brings about this science fictional horror aspect to the movie. Also, the movie came out in 1972, so the effects of the movie are completely practical. We weren't quite into, computer graphics or anything yet. So all the things that you see, including there's some transformations and some things that happen in the movie, they're all very practical, which kind of gives them a little bit of a campy feel. Now, when this movie came out, it didn't really get a whole lot of critical response. But since then, it has gone on to be a huge favorite, and turns out it's quite inspirational to a lot of other movies that came out after it. It's received mixed reviews over the past few years, but I think, like me, I appreciate the mix of horror and sci-fi because some of my favorite horror movies are mixed with horror and sci-fi. I'm one of those people that likes the blend of horror and sci-fi. I mean, my favorite horror movie of all time is The Thing. John Carpenter's The Thing was so ahead of its time, especially the practical effects in 1982, and I think it still holds up to this day. But I'm also a big fan of the Alien franchise, that mix, again, of sci-fi and horror. It's one of my favorite things because I love sci-fi and I love horror, and you put those things together, and if it's done right, it's just so ideal. But I do think it's difficult to put both of those genres together and still pull off a good movie. But this film, I think, does it in a way where I'm not even sure sci-fi was really that big of a genre back in 1972 when I think of all the movies that are really, influential in the sci-fi genre. When you think about something like Star Wars that just kicked off so many, amazing films and influenced so many people to do things. I mean, let's be honest. Battlestar Galactica, the TV show, the 70s TV show, was hugely influenced by Star Wars. There's no doubt about it. Even James Bond went to space in Moonraker. People really latched onto this sci-fi thing. So you think of 1972, where sci-fi wasn't quite as popular as, say, horror. Mixing these two together in the way that they did it, I think it's just so good. It's one of those movies that just stuck in my brain after all these years. And I really believe that this movie, while it does seem clearly derivative of Who Goes There, The Thing from Another Planet, I really do feel like it does kind of have its own story. A lot of people will look at it and say there's some campiness to it, but I mean, I would argue that there are way more campier movies that came out around the same time or even after that. I think that it has this very nostalgic charm to it, especially the setting and when it takes place. And the whole idea that it's being contained on this train and this really claustrophobic feeling. I just remember watching this as a kid and just be completely just enthralled by it. Now, like I said, I did not see this in theaters. I don't think my parents would have let me see this movie at the age that I saw it. I was just sitting on my grandfather's couch watching TV. It came on, and this movie has stuck with me with all these years. And I can honestly say that this was the first horror movie that I ever saw, and I still think it's one of my favorites. As I did research on this movie and I looked at a lot of the trivia, there was some really interesting things about it. For example, there was no audio recorded during the filming of this movie. All the audio was done in post. Now, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and Telly Savalas came back and did their voiceovers. As a matter of fact, various roles in the film were dubbed by the same person. There was Roger Delgado, who would do multiple characters, and there was Robert Rietti, who would do other characters that were on the train. And then there was Olive Gregg, who did all of the female characters. And what's really funny too is I read that Telly Savalas actually improvised a lot of his dialogue. So imagine having to go back and do the dub over to improvise dialogue. I think it's such a great movie. I don't want to spoil anything because there's some really good twists. There's also some things in this movie that I found to be sort of a reflection of maybe some social issues or even views of maybe how certain people are really viewed, or maybe how people see certain types of characters in real life. So kind of to sum up the movie without any spoilers, an archaeologist has found a frozen creature, a prehistoric frozen human type creature, and has decided to transport this creature on the Trans-Siberian Express across Russia, along with a bunch of other unsuspecting passengers. Things go awry with a mix of horror and sci-fi. Now, again, I don't want to ruin this, but I will tell you that the creature does tend to cause some problems on the train, and in ways that you may not expect, but then I did tell you that it is very similar to The Thing from Another World. So I would say if you're into horror movies and you definitely want to watch something a little old and kind of fun, I think you should check out Horror Express. It is one of my favorite movies. It's got a little sci-fi, it's got a little horror, it's got some twists, and I think it's just very entertaining. So if you've made it this far, thank you for watching the video. If you can, I would like to know what the first horror movie you ever saw was. Just drop it in the comments, and I'll be talking about another movie that I really like very soon. Thanks for watching.